Adaptations are all around us. Some obvious, others not so much. Transporting a story from one medium into another is one of the biggest artistic challenges a creative can face. What does the very act of adaptation entail? And what separates a good adaptation from a bad one? Enter Spider-Man into the Spider-Verse. So the real question isn't whether to adapt or not to adapt, but rather how to adapt. Commenting on the incipient art of cinema, in 1926, Virginia Woolf wrote in the British weekly newspaper, The Nation and the Athenaeum, all the famous novels of the world, with their well-known characters and their famous scenes, only asked, it seemed, to be put on the films. What could be easier and simpler? The cinemas fell upon its prey with immense rapacity, and to the moment, largely subsists upon the body of its unfortunate victim. But the results are disastrous to both. In her essay, Woolf criticized most literary adaptations for merely converting words into pictures, wasting cinema's distinguishing characteristics. All this, which is accessible to words and to words alone, the cinema must avoid, she said. Every art form has its own specific codes, tools, and means of expression. A successful adaptation embraces the unique formal traits of the medium it's targeting and aspires to create something that stands on its own as a genuine work in that medium. To understand why Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse is such an effective adaptation, let's start by separating the form from the content and analyzing them independently. So, what is Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse about? Ever since Brian Michael Bendis and artist Sara Pichelli introduced the character of Miles Morales in 2011's Ultimate Fallout No. 4, the main premise of Miles' story has been defined by a simple yet substantial question: who can be Spider-Man? When Marvel announced their plans to introduce a new Afro-Latino version of Spider-Man, public opinion was stirred.
The new Spider-Man, you see him on the front page of the Blaze. The new Spider-Man is really quite great. He looks just like President Obama. It's fantastic.
They were talking about on this geek blog about, making Spider-Man, they're redoing it. And maybe, Spider-Man, maybe he doesn't have to be white. Maybe he can be black or Hispanic or something like that. And then somebody put a big picture of me in the comments. It was like, Donald Glover can play Spider-Man. He's nerdy. That's when the world went crazy. And half the world was like, Donald for Spider-Man. We're only gonna watch the next Spider-Man if Donald Glover's playing Peter Parker. And the other half was like, he's black, kill him! Like, it was so fast.
At the time, Brian Michael Bendis was in Chicago, present on the set of the television show Powers, itself an adaptation from one of his own comics. While on set, actor Khary Payton, known for his role as the voice of Cyborg in the Teen Titans and playing Ezekiel in The Walking Dead, had heard the news about Miles and Spider-Man, and approaches Bendis to tell him a personal tale. When I was a kid, Payton said, all we played was superheroes. And my friends wouldn't let me be anything but Spider-Man because of the color of my skin. I couldn't be Superman, I couldn't be Batman, but I could be Spider-Man because anyone could be in that costume. So I just want you to know that's what you're doing. You're telling kids anyone can be in this costume. Into the Spider-Verse could have focused on other aspects from the source material for their adaptation. Miles' process of learning and adapting to his new powers, the relationship with his family, or his romantic interests, the comedic aspects between him and Genki Lee, the villains, or they could have made the movie a straight rendition of the tried and tested hero's journey archetype. In the end, they concocted a narrative with all of these traits, but in a time of social upheaval, reivindication of minority rights, and culture wars, the filmmakers decided to pick that essential question: who can be Spider-Man? As a timely reflection of this articular historical moment, and that idea permeates every single frame of the animated adaptation and serves as the emotional drive of the movie. A critical relation between one text and another is what French literary theorist Gérard Genette would define as metatextuality. In his book from 1982, Palimpsests, He would define intertextuality as the effective co-presence of two texts. In the same sense, from the very beginning of the movie, the filmmakers of Into the Spider-Verse make the deliberate effort to make it crystal clear that the project has one foot firmly grounded in the world of comics, and the other in the world of film. Into the Spider-Verse opens with the stamp of the Comics Code Authority, a nostalgic callback to a crucial piece of comic book history and to Marvel's own role in the evolution of the industry. The Comics Code Authority was a self-regulatory body established in 1954 in response to public and media concern about the content of comic books, particularly those in the genre of horror and crime.
The book shows how the bride murders her husband by chopping his head off with an axe. So shocking that I couldn't mention even the scientific term on television.
The Comics Code Authority seal of approval ensured buyers that the content of a comic was suitable for all audiences. However, their extremely prudish, draconian guidelines choked the creativity out of creators and forced them into self-censorship.
Illicit sex relations are neither to be hinted at nor portrayed. Violent love scenes as well as sexual abnormalities are unacceptable.
It was Marvel who challenged the CCA's authority in the 1970s by publishing controversial comics without seeking approval, efforts that progressively diminished the importance of the code until the organization was rendered obsolete by the early 2000s. Interestingly, as soon as the movie grounds itself in the world of comics, it proceeds to firmly place itself in the world of film.
All right, let's do this one last time.
Peter Parker introduces himself with a montage of scenes from the Sam Raimi's Spider-Man films, acknowledging a corner of the Marvel Universe that surprisingly is already 20 years old. In just the first 2 minutes of the film, Into the Spider-Verse manages to effectively set the goalposts, calling out both the source material and the target medium, while it sets the narrative in motion. It's the adaptation that takes an active stance towards the source material, the result being more than a mere resuscitation, but an ongoing dialogical process. From very early in the development stage, the aesthetic premise of Into the Spider-Verse was quite clear. Alberto Mielgo, one of the first animators brought on board to help develop the look of the film, lays down their declaration of intent to explore the language of comics and cinema and merge them together. To talk about form, we have to begin by defining the source and the target medium. What exactly makes the language of comics and cinema different from each other?
So here's my dad. He's a scientist, he's an engineer, and he's a military contractor. So he has 4 kids, right? One grows up to become a computer scientist, one grows up to join the Navy, one grows up to become an engineer, and then there's me, the comic book artist.
In his 1994 book, Understanding Comics, cartoonist and comic theorist Scott McCloud defines the comic book medium as juxtaposed pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence, intended to convey informative and/or to produce an aesthetic response in the viewer. The basic building blocks that constitute the grammar of the comic book medium can be boiled down to panels, gutters, word balloons, thought balloons, captions, and sound effects. The concept of sequence is at the core of McCloud's definition, but other academics disagree. Author, critic, and cartoonist Robert C. Harvey provides a slightly different insight in his essay, How Comics Came to Be. While McCloud's definition would not consider as comics one-panel strips, like Gary Larson's famous The Far Side, Harvey's interpretation does. It seems to me that the essential characteristic of comics, the thing that distinguishes it from other kinds of pictorial narratives, is the incorporation of verbal content. Words and pictures blend to achieve a meaning that neither conveys alone without the other. To McCloud, sequence is at the heart of the functioning of comics. To me, blending verbal and visual content is. Comics are a medium that defies easy categorization, but their power is undeniable because of their distinctive way of combining words and images. Comics have a unique and incredible ability to capture both interior thought and exterior action. They borrow from literature the ability to render the rich inner world of characters, while also incorporating the visual impact of painting and the dynamic storytelling of cinema. Pop culture critic and author Douglas Wolk sums the power of comics quite well in his 2008 book, Reading Comics. Comics are not prose. Comics are not movies. They are not a text-driven medium with added pictures. They are not a visual equivalent of a prose narrative or a static version of a film. They are their own thing, a medium with its own devices, its own innovators, its own cliches, its own genres and traps and liberties. Opera may have been Richard Wagner's idea of the total work of art, the Gesamtkunstwerk, the grand medium that unites all other arts. But it was actually cinema, an art form that took off merely a decade after his death, the one that managed to fulfill that ideal. In fact, film theorist Robert Stam defines cinema as that all-encompassing art form Wagner theorized about. A composite language by virtue of its diverse matters of expression, sequential photography, music, phonetic sound, and noise. The cinema inherits all the art forms associated with these matters of expression. The visuals of photography and painting, the movement of dance, the decor of architecture, and the performance of theater.
I find that every day that I'm directing, I'm trying to synthesize all of the arts. You know, writing, composition, photography, performance, music, painting, I mean, everything, editing, is all contained in the art of filmmaking.
When Virginia Woolf criticized cinema in 1926 for being too reliant on literature, she wondered if in a time of the then nascent art form would ever be able to escape from its narrative constraints and flourish into a language of its own, a new medium that could deliver experiences only conceivable on celluloid. While all other art forms are born naked, this, the youngest, has been born fully clothed, she said. It can say everything before it has anything to say.
We do not have an image-based cinema, we have a text-based cinema. Every single film, absolutely every single film you'll probably ever seen started life as a text, even if that's a scribble on the back of an envelope. So therefore, you know, it's not really, I mean, sometimes I would say, we've never seen any cinema. Cinema doesn't exist.
Almost 100 years later, some could say cinema is still clumsily hammering away.
Je crois que tous les éléments, images, son, y compris paroles, bruit, musique, sont des éléments qui doivent travailler les uns sur les autres et transformer. Il n'y a pas d'art sans transformation. Et c'est cette forme cinématographique qui est importante et qui doit passer avant tout. C'est-à-dire que quand vous composez un plan, c'est ce plan cette composition qui doit exprimer quelque chose avant même les personnages. Ces plans doivent avoir en eux-mêmes la valeur d'une idée.
Into the Spider-Verse is so successful as an adaptation because it manages precisely that, to transform the language of comics into the experience only possible in film. Pixar's iconic debut film, Toy Story, in 1995, captivated audiences with its unique blend of photorealism and stylization. Since then, Pixar has further refined and perfected this distinctive look, prompting other studios to adopt a similar aesthetic. This has led audiences to expect certain features from their animated movies, things like physically based lighting, smooth animation, and lifelike translucency. These attributes aim to emulate the real world as closely as possible. The crew of Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse decided to take the opposite direction, aiming for a hyper-stylized, illustrated look taken directly from the world of comics. For example, most photorealistic animation uses motion blur as a tool to emulate the characteristic blur from real lenses. Into the Spider-Verse used instead techniques from classic cartooning, like motion lines, smears, and doubling. If you look at any mass-produced comic book, you may notice a common error where the color plates have been slightly misaligned during the printing process, leaving a color offset visible mostly in the outline.
The way that the colors might be misprinted if they weren't lined up properly. So it definitely puts one area in focus, but at the same time, it still avoids that lens feel or the softness.
Instead of rendering the depth of field with Gaussian blur like a real-world lens, the filmmakers choose to use a color offset instead, achieving an effect similar to what you'd get off a 4-pass printing press. They also used half-tone dots, another trait taken from the print world, to enhance lights and shadows. Jack Kirby, often referred to as the King of Comics, was known for using very distinctive blobs and fractal-like patterns to depict things like explosions, force fields, vortexes, or rays. This stylistic device, called Kirby Crackle, is used multiple times in the film, for example, when portals are opened and especially during the final fight. Spider-Man co-creator Steve Ditko introduced very distinctive squiggly lines around Peter Parker's head to show when his spider senses were activated. Into the Spider-Verse uses the same device.
Miles, the hardest thing about this job is you can't always save everybody.
Like if it was my fault, you wouldn't understand.
Miles, we're probably the only ones who do understand.
Sound effects, narration boxes, and actual panels. All formal tools characteristic of comics are repurposed, or as Bresson would say, transformed to create a unique visual experience. One of the most ingenious things they did in the movie was to use Framerate to develop character. Animated films are typically made 24 frames per second, with a different image or phase of movement in each frame. That technique is known as animating on ones. Animating on ones results in smooth, fluid movement. Into the Spider-Verse decided to break the mold and animate Miles on twos, meaning one new image every 2 frames. Animating on twos keeps each image on screen for 2 frames, giving the animation a crunchy feel, as the animators would describe it. Miles is animated on twos when the filmmakers want to depict him as unskilled and clumsy, yet progressively changes him to ones to show how he acquires confidence as the story progresses. The sequence where they're swinging in the forest, for example, Miles is on twos to contrast his lack of experience against Peter B. Parker, who is animated on ones. As Miles becomes comfortable with his powers, animators match the frame rate of both characters to help illustrate Miles' growth. Another clever use of animation can be seen in the different Spider People, where they use different styles for each characters, with references from anime to Chuck Jones. All these stylistic choices and techniques are put in service of creating an experience that transforms the source material, stories from Brian Michael Bendis' Miles Morales' run, and Dan Slott's Spider-Verse, into a film that is eminently cinematic. This is an adaptation that doesn't merely translates, but transforms the source material into something bold and new that stands on its own. Adaptation is the creative expression of our need to uncover new truths, rediscover old ones, and forge new connections to our shared human experience. It's only when we revisit old stories and re-examine old ideas through the lens of time that we realize how much our values have changed, and also how much we're still the same. But want to find out how this other film was made? Check out this video here to find out more.